One of the greatest strengths of Google Analytics is the intuitive interface, which allows users to easily create an account and get started tracking their digital assets without large amounts of prior knowledge. However, this is a double-edged sword, because decisions about how you initially structure your account can be very difficult, if not impossible, to undo at a later point, and can have large ramifications on your ability to extract maximum value from your account. For your average blogger or hobby site, this may not matter. But for business or power users, we'll want to dive deeper, and the first place to start is how the data, users, and reports are structured on the back end of the Google Analytics servers themselves. Most underlying element of this hierarchy is the user login. This is the Google account, and perhaps the login you use for your Gmail, Google+, or any other Google service. It is simply the username and password that you use to log in to authenticate to Google. This is not your Google Analytics account. That comes next in the hierarchy. Note that you can have more than one of these. Then, there are the web properties, the views, and the reports themselves. This is much clearer with an actual example, so let's take a look at a common configuration. First is the user login. Note this is not necessarily a Gmail account. It does have to be a Google account, but we actually recommend that you don't use Gmail for your business accounts. Now, the account is the overall administration. This has the user permissions, the time zones, sharing settings, that kind of thing. But the interesting stuff actually starts above here, as the account doesn't actually collect or contain any data. That's all contained here in the web properties. Now, historically, these are the most confusing part of Google Analytics. Each of these web properties has a unique number we call a UA number. Now, there are no hard and fast rules, but most think of this as different websites or applications. You run mydomain.com, but then you're sponsoring a large amount of content for the Olympics, and you have that content on a microsite that will be tracked and measured on its own. That would go under its own web property. You could create a separate account, but since it will be evaluated by the same marketing team and entirely run by the company, it's most convenient to keep it in the same account. In which case, you could keep it under the same company account, but you'll want a separate web property to track those metrics and interactions that apply to a mobile app specifically, such as the data on the visitors who download your app, crash reports, that kind of thing. You may also have a web property that will roll up all the sites. And one thing I need to talk about here for a minute is sampling. Since this is where the data actually lives and that is the main database, this is where sampling occurs. It used to be that sampling happened at the view level, but recently that changed to where sampling happens at the property level, regardless of what filters you may have applied to your view. Now remember, in order for any new web properties to collect data, you will have to generate a new analytics tag with its own unique UA number. For views, these are previously known as profiles, and I occasionally lapse back into calling them that, but some find the new name actually very intuitive, as really these are just views on the data that is held in those web properties. These views are generally controlled by filters that contain minor and occasionally major edits on the data, such as an uppercase filter or adding in the subdomain as part of the URL, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there are the reports themselves. The reports are based on the settings in the view that modify how you see the data that's contained in the property. Let's take a look at how this might look in an actual example. When you log into Google Analytics, you're going to see a screen like this. This is your home screen. One of the first things I want to point out is the login here at the top. And again, this is going to be your Gmail account or your otherwise Google account that is going to control which of these accounts you have access to. In this case, I have access to these two different accounts with this login. There's two different ways to see these accounts. You can either see them by the folders or by this drop-down menu on the top, which you can expand and contract. Web properties live under there, which we can see by expanding this. And under each of these web properties are the views, and if I want to see the actual reports, they live here in the views. Now, there are a few best practices to keep in mind. First and foremost, always keep a raw or unfiltered view that you never touch. Roll-up reports are usually best in their own web property. And for those unfamiliar, roll-up reports are what you have when you're trying to collect stats from across several different sites. For example, if you are the CMO of Procter & Gamble and you want to look across all the different brands at once to understand the number of mobile users versus desktop, for example, you may choose to have a set of reports that automatically roll up all the individual brand websites. There are a few reasons to do this in its own web property, But the primary two are access, who should be allowed to see that information, and sampling. Because sampling happens at the web property level, even if you were to filter out a view for each brand from the rollup web property, such that the reports only contain data from the brand site, it would still be sampled based on all the data in the web property, which is to put two separate UA numbers in the tracking script on the site. I also recommend that you have one account per business entity. If you have two different resorts owned by the same holding company, but each have their own separate marketing teams, then they should be two accounts, and you simply grant access to both accounts to the logins of those who require it, that you use to test various new configurations, such as filters, search settings, that kind of thing. And make sure that those work the way that you think they do before you move them into production. And don't be afraid to create useful views. There's no benefit in letting them go unused. Now that said, you'll want to give some thought to how you want to set them up. Google used to allow users to increase their views well beyond the initial 50 limit. But recently they've become much more strict about this, even for premium users. So if you come up with a strategy that will lead you to over 50 views, for example, if you have one for each of your 75 sales branches, you'll want to rethink that. Now that you understand how Google Analytics is structured internally, I hope it will allow you to better architect your account to take full advantage of the features and avoid some of the issues. This hierarchy will become particularly important when we examine how to assign user permissions and at what level we do so in this hierarchy.